Luke is going to have, Hershey will have a microphone, and Kent will have a microphone. They're going to go around, and I want to ask you a question into the mic, just so everybody can hear it. And then they're going to hold on to the microphone, so don't take it from them, because we actually don't want you to do a tirade or anything like that. Remember, you're asking a question. And yeah, so let's, I think before we do that, though, I think that Michael's going to say a few words on another concept that's going to be useful in the Q&A for a few minutes, and then we'll jump in, okay? Great, you're installing, you good?
All right. Okay. So, I mentioned in the beginning, we were talking about this idea of justice. I just wanted to talk about a couple of kind of quick, I said we did maybe like an intellectual cleanup, is what I call it sometimes. Because we all kind of, we live in a time and a certain place where there's certain ways of thinking, and we just acclimate to them. Like C.S. Lewis has this line in Abolition of Man, which is probably my favorite Lewis book, where he says, you find yourself on the side of a philosophical controversy that you don't even know existed, right? And that's just reality. I mean, it happens all the time. And so sometimes what I want to just do very quickly before and then talk to justice and we'll do Q&A is just briefly think about a couple of things that we fall prey to that are, some are more obvious than others, and some are less obvious. But one of the things we fall prey to was actually what Pastor Nick was just saying. We kind of fall prey to like a mechanistic view of ourselves and the world in a utilitarianism, right? So you have, for example, in computer science, in neuroscience, one of the models you hear in neuroscience a lot is this idea like the brain is like a computer. Well, but it's not actually. We made computers. And then what we do is we're like, oh, well, we made a clock or a computer, and now, we're like the clock. I'm like, well, maybe. I mean, enough of the way that we made it, and so we created algorithms, and if we reduce the brain to a computer, then we're using a copy of a copy, right? It's bad, it's like, it doesn't work, okay? I mean, I can go into more detail with that. But there's a wonderful book that I like a lot of neuroscience. I won't bore you with all the details, but they make, this philosopher and neuroscientist got together and wrote this book, and they said, there's a lot of problems in neuroscience. One of them is, it's just filled with conceptual errors, okay? And one of them is this. One of the things you'll hear a lot if you read any neuroscience, which I think is very fascinating. I like the fact that we're embodied biological being made out of the dust of the earth, so I think it's pretty awesome. But then you'll hear like this kind of idea that the brain did this, or my frontal lobe, or like the amygdala did that, okay? And one of the things they point out is, if you think about what's actually happening, what we're looking at is what they call mutant Cartesianism. Okay, now this is how bad things get. At night, I was reading this book, and I read mutant Cartesianism, and I started laughing. My wife said, "You are the dorkiest person in America." I'm like, that's hilarious. Anyway, but Cartesianism is basically, Descartes said, oh, well, there's like the mind, our thinking, and then there's matter extension, and there's like the mind body. And they said, well, most of neuroscience is just like Cartesianism turned into the brain and the rest of you, right? My brain did this. And as this guy points out, like, well, who is this self that has a brain? Well, my frontal lobe. Okay, well, who has the frontal lobe? Who? And the answer is you do. You saw it, right? Your brain didn't decide. You decided. But you're an embodied biological animal, the brain. And so, like, my hand picked up this pen. Well, my brain directed my hand to pick up the pen, but who am I? Okay? And so there's a conceptual error around this that kind of goes to the utilitarian. We kind of think of ourselves mechanistically, or we think of ourselves in a utilitarian manner. And so that's why tulips matter so much. They really matter. Because and I talk about this every Christmas, I'm amazed. My wife and my mother-in-law who come to visit, don't tell her I said anything nice about her. If I had a radio show, I was thinking of having her on, and I would call it the Mother-in-Law Minute, because it's all you can take. She said, all right. Thank you, thank you. You know when you told her, oh, you know that's actually good. But no, she's a wonderful, wonderful lady. Don't keep that quiet. But anyway, so she and my wife and my daughters, you know, will make the house like filled with mystery and wonder. It's Christmas season. And I'm taken by it. It's part of the invisibility. Like, it doesn't just happen. Somebody makes it happen. And it's so magnificent. So one of the conceptual errors as we think about persons is to kind of mechanize ourselves. Okay? And we have to make sure we catch it because we live in a technical, mechanistic, utilitarian world. So we don't want to think just because we can make machines doesn't mean we are a machine. So I thought that was a good point. Second thing that's kind of a thing we fall into is just the problem of relativism broadly. Okay? The idea that there's no truth. And this you probably have heard and think about a lot, but these words are meant. You know, people will say, I used to teach undergraduates, there's no truth. And I always say, is that true? And I say, yes, it's true. There's no truth. Truth does not exist. Truth does not exist. Is that true? Okay, yes. I say, well, so that's one truth. It's like, wait, yes, but that's the only truth. Is that true too? So now we have two truths. Okay. And I say, okay, fine. Okay, they exist, but you can't know it. I'm like, do you know that? I'm positive. Okay, so you know, that's the only thing we can know, is you can't know the truth. So that's two truths that you know. Okay, and the point is, it's self-refuting, it's incoherent, it doesn't hold. Okay, and how many of you have read The Abolition of Man by C.S. Lewis? Okay, oh, all right. You've got to read The Abolition of Man. Am I right?
Yes.
Oh my goodness.
It's a very short book.
It's short. Okay, the first chapter is called Men Without Chests. It's so good. He says their chest, he said their heads look big, their intellects, like these professor types. Yeah, he was a professor. These professor types, their heads look big. That's just because their chests are so atrophied, right? Because they don't have chests. He said, we laugh at honor, and we're shocked to find traitors in our midst. He said, we castrate and we bid the geldings be fruitful. We've created men without trust. We've robbed people of their patrimony. We've taken away this idea of nobility and heroism and wonder and the power of a human being to accomplish something great. And we reduce ourselves to this kind of like, and he said, and it starts actually in grammar school with critical thinking exercises, where we get like kind of wound up into thinking something, and he says we find ourselves on the side of a controversy we don't even know exists. Just read the first like 15 or 20 pages. This book is awesome. Okay, I mean it's fantastic, and it's so relevant to today and technocracy and everything else. Okay, so let me give you an example of the truth problem. There's another problem that comes with the problem of reason. I'm going to talk tomorrow about how, I'll probably mention this briefly, but it's too much tomorrow. Sunday. Saturday talk. Reason, we think about reason as like empirical discursive reason, like, you know, and we think, and there's a deeply held belief in the West that in order for something to be reasonable, it has to be empirically measurable and verifiable. And unless you can show it to me empirically, it's just a feeling. Okay. Well, there's a lot of problems with that. I mean, I would say most of us in this room kind of fall into that. Not because we're bad, it's because that's what everybody thinks. And we just kind of, we went to school and this is what happens. We think, but if you pause and you think, well, let's just wait like a minute on that. In order for something to be reasonable, rational, it's got to be measurable and empirical. That means like love, beauty, goodness, friendship, prudence, hope, justice, mercy, compassion. Those aren't reasonable. So it takes the fundamental human experiences that matter the most and it puts them outside the realm of reason. But love is reasonable. I respond to the value of my beloved wife and see that she's a unique, unrepeatable person and all of the things that only I can see because love is not blind, love is creative. Right? And I respond and I love her, make an act of the will that I love her and will her good. That's reasonable. Do you know, okay, don't want to get in trouble. I'm going to quote the Catechism of the Catholic Church, one of the definitions of sin is an offense against reason. No, it's sad, but it's so good. Why? They got one thing right. Okay. That and they make pretty good wine. Okay, so why? Think about this. This is an offense against reason. Okay, so I'm going to pause for that a second. Oh, no. Okay. Lust is a sin, right? Is the desire for union with your beloved spouse a sin? No. It could be, but no, right? No. Is lust a sin? Yeah. Why? Because lust takes a person who's a subject with hopes, wants, dreams, and fears, unrepeatable, unique person created in the image of God, a daughter or a son of God, mostly daughters. Men are worse at this than men, and women do it too. Who is love and has a purpose and an everlasting destiny. And what lust does is it isolates the sexual values. Responding to the sexual values is fine. That's human and good. That's what God made us. But it isolates the sexual values and turns the woman into an object, which is an offense against reason, because it's not reasonable to treat a subject like an object. It's a sin to treat a subject like an object. Okay? Notice, but reasonable. You can't tell me reason because I can't measure it. No, because reason goes way beyond the empirical. It goes to love, it goes to justice, it goes to other things. Think about, we've talked about justice. If justice, give me the empirical measurement of justice. Can't. Oh, okay, so justice isn't reasonable. So if justice isn't reasonable, justice is simply the rule of the stronger, or whatever's efficient. And that's why Lewis says man's power over nature is always some men's power over other men. So unless justice has something we can actually talk about, it just becomes the rule of the stronger. But you need to be able to have reason to talk about justice. Okay? So I'm going to finish very quickly, but I'm going to talk briefly about justice one more time in the Ring of Gyges. To wrap it up, you need to have a rich concept of reason. Now, here's the good news. The dominant view of reason in the West is all non-empirical things are not rational. So here's the question. Okay, deal. Explain to me empirically that reason is limited to the empirical. That makes you philosophy. Demonstrate to me empirically that reason is only limited to the empirical. You can't do it. Right. Because the statement, the position that reason is only empirical is not an empirical concept. It's just a statement. So it's incoherent on its own terms. It doesn't hold. It's just a dictate from a dictator. Okay, you know I like Benedict XVI. He had a thing, he says, we live in a dictatorship of relativism. Why? Relativism always is a dictatorship. Because unless you're open to reality and truth and the existence of the good, the true, and the beautiful, then it just becomes what you think, and then you dictate what's true. You dictate who's a person. Right? You dictate what's just. And then the state's the arbiter of justice. It's just false. Okay? So get to this. So truth and reason, we're swimming in this kind of area there, right, where there's a lot of confusion. So one of the things, and that's fast, but one of the things I challenge you to do is to examine our assumptions. Secularism is not neutral. Secularism, you're just bringing religion to the matter. Everybody's bringing religion to the matter. Everybody's bringing assumptions and beliefs and a prioris into the discussion. Everybody. Okay, so know what yours are. Okay, there's a lot more I can say, but let me say one thing to wrap up with justice. So, what is justice? Two things. Justice is, generally, the tradition is to give each person his due. And then it's also a virtue, it's a habit. And that habit means that the just man justices. There's a poem by Gerard Manley Hopkins, the just man justices, okay? That means justice, it's a commitment of the will to consistently give another his due or her due. That's why lust is an act of injustice and an offense against reason. Follow me? See it? It's an offense against reason and it's injustice because you're not giving the person their due and you're not responding to them as a subject. Okay? And so then this goes back to the ring of Diogenes. The question of justice is also the act of a person. It's a virtue, it's an act of a person. It's not simply that the state is just. We must live justly. Even when the law says you can do that. Because we've conflated legality with morality. And not every sin should be illegal. Right? Can you imagine if like lying was illegal? Like, 8-year-old, you're in trouble. Okay, you can't do that, right? That doesn't work. But just because something's legal doesn't mean it's moral. So again, the ring of Diogenes is around us constantly. And how are we going to think about it? And there's more I can say, but the last thing is we also need to make distinctions. I don't have time for if it comes up. But how we think about justice, there's multiple ways of thinking about justice as well. There's commutative justice, which is exchange. I buy the iPhone, I pay him the money. He does work, I give him money. It's commutative, it's exchange. Then there's justice that I have with my 8-year-old daughter. I'm sorry you didn't work, you don't eat. Like, no, that's not how it works. Okay? He's like, no, Dad, that's an injustice. You're doing an injustice to me because distributive justice means that I have distributive responsibilities to give to my children what they need, what's owed to them. Okay? What's owed to them. And it's not commutative, it's not exchange. There's no equal. I receive something, I distribute the justice. One of the biggest problems we have in America and the West today is we confuse those. So we think, oh, well, the state should do that. And then meanwhile, Gary Becker, he's a free market economist at the University of Chicago, he was like, well, I have a podcast coming out about this with a very thoughtful person who talks about this injustice. And well, each child, you know, you're in a commutative justice. Each child has a certain right. Some of your children are Cadillacs, and some of your children are Chevrolets, and you want to invest in the Cadillacs, you know, and keep the Chevrolet running, I guess. Okay, this is applying commutative justice to the family. That's an error. Okay, the family is not a free market. And then some people will say, oh, the family's socialist. Like, no, that's dumb. The family's not socialist. Sorry to say dumb, but it's dumb. And because it's a place of distributive justice. Socialism means like nobody owns private property. Like, that doesn't mean anything. Okay? Religion is the opiate of the people. No, right? No, it's a place of distributive justice. So as we begin to think through these questions of justice, remember like, oh, there's a place for different kinds of justice at different kinds of times. There's a place in the state for distributive justice. There's a tornado that takes place, right? Or like a war or something. The state's going to get involved, and they're going to start to help provide assistance and everything in a distributive way. So if there's a tornado that comes through this table, Tyler's house is destroyed and Ryan's house is not destroyed. The state does not practice commutative justice. All right, $50 for you and $50 for you. No, they give the money to Tyler, not to Ryan. Because you take into account the need of the person, right? So all these things are out there. I know that's really fast. But like, there are ways in the Christian tradition to think very deeply about justice and policy and family and how to do it. And so getting these things kind of cleaned up and not thinking accidentally like a secularist or not buying into bad ideas of reason and truth really actually matter. And the last thing is I know, like, okay, oh my goodness, a philosopher, Saturday, what is philosophy? I want to know what's practical. But I'm telling you right now, get reason wrong, you will make major practical errors. If you get justice wrong, justice gets written into law, and then the law makes disastrous practical errors. If you get prudence and charity wrong, we hurt the very people we're trying to help. And so these things really do matter, and luckily, we are embedded in a wonderful, beautiful tradition with theologians and philosophers and saints who have helped think this through. And so the joy is we have this massive resource to use, and I think we should use it. So that's the end. Q&A.
I'll let you guys know later how these videos and audio will be available. We're going to do a couple of podcasts with Michael later that will come out on Engage and Equip that you could hear a little bit more questions and stuff. I did tell people that we were DH at noon, and so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take about a 3-minute break. So if you want to leave, but you don't feel like you can just walk out in front of everybody, you can leave, right? And then just a couple of minutes, I'm going to ask you to take your seats again, and we'll do Q&A until about 12:30, okay? And volunteers, if you have certain stuff up, I don't know what your backstop commitments are time-wise. So I don't want to presume on your afternoon in ways I shouldn't. So let's take a break. We'll be back in 3 minutes. Yeah, I'm going to stay here to make editorial comments, okay? No.
What kind of comments?
Editorial. Like if I think somebody didn't get something that you said, I might make it look a little sentence.
I absolutely did not say that. Anybody have questions?
All right, here we go, right here.
Start here?
Yep.
You alluded to charity relative to the poor. You didn't go as far as I thought you might, so my question is, we have this many poor, we have this many churches, let's put it that way. How do you see the balance in the churches being able to handle a certain amount of charity, but can't handle all of it? So that's where the government comes
Yeah, so
in.
that's,
Hear a little more about that.
sure. That's a very good question. Again, we're now obviously entering the realm of prudential, right? So this is very important. I want to make this distinction. This is a prudential discussion. So we would start with certain foundations of the human person, dignity, the goodness of what does human flourishing look like, the justice of the state, etc. And then we go into this prudential question. Okay? And I'm repeating that because it's like there's not one single Christian way to answer this. Okay? But let me try to answer it how I would answer it based on history and the principle of subsidiarity. Okay, so the principle of subsidiarity means those closest to the problem handle the problem. As one person put it, I liked it. I said I was going to steal it. He said, "Your neighbor helps you before the state helps you." Okay, so when there's a problem of poverty, first we're looking at and knowledge is very important. The knowledge, so you start this person's in poverty. Why? How do we figure out what are their needs? Is it emergencies, is there disease, there's sickness, their health, is there mental health, is there addiction, or was there abuse, and what's the situation? You look at it. The people around them maybe actually perpetuate the problem. So they might have bonding social capital, but not what's called a bridging social capital to help them get out and solve their problem of poverty. So you begin to look, so who can help first? Is there a family member? No. Is there a cousin, an aunt, an uncle? Is there a neighbor? Is there somebody in the local community, in the church? Is there a church? Are they in this radius of high point? Can we create a way to help deal with them? Okay, no, and if that keeps going no, then you're going to get to a point where then the public, city, and if the city can't handle it, then the state, and the state can't handle it, then the national government, the federal government can handle it. Okay, one of the problems we have, especially since the 1960s with the war on poverty, but even before that, was this idea that we looked first to the nation, like the federal, the largest area, instead of going with the smallest area. So one is just an attitudinal way of thinking about the best way to help the poor. Okay. Now, then there's a second question, which is how do we think about this question of are there too many people to be helped? And this actually leads to a couple of things. One, what we've seen is a crowd-out effect since the 1960s. There was welfare before the welfare state. In fact, there were many mutual aid societies. Sorry, this thing is just not hooking on right. There were mutual aid societies. So, for example, has anyone ever heard here of a medical group called Samaritan Ministries? Okay, you know that. Okay, that's an example of a mutual aid society. Okay, you basically opted out of, say, company or government health. You are in a partnership where people and you send. So the way it basically works is you join, you sign an agreement of this is how you're going to live, this is what you're going to do. You make a deal that you'll always try to at least negotiate the price down and pay cash. And then when you do that, you live that, you send in your needs, and then other people from all over the country send you checks. And then you pay the bills. Okay, that's a mutual aid society. Catholics were the Knights of Columbus, right? The Knights of Columbus. Catholics were really in many ways excluded from participating in a lot of social life. They had, they also had, questions like disability and death and everything. So the Knights of Columbus was an insurance organization that started to create community and sodalities. So there were many sodalities, Protestant, Catholic, and secular, in the United States with welfare before the welfare state. As the state came in, it actually crowded some of those things out. And so it's not simply a question historically of, oh, there were too many people and not enough government services. Actually, the government services diminished the number of private voluntary services where there's mutual responsibility. And a lot of times those things aren't just like somebody helping. If you're all in the same sodality with disability, and Scott Miller, right? Okay, and Scott hurts his back, but he's really kind of faking it. He's hurting Larry's family. He's taking Larry's money. Okay, right? We knew Scott was bad, and so what happened is Scott's like, I'm not going to hurt Larry's family, right? And so there's this mutual growth there. Now, the last thing I'll say is in 1948 was a thing called the Bedford Report, which was not about drinking, but was about an English. It was in England, and it was about basically the welfare state. And so the idea of it was actually going to be a very small social safety net. But what happened is that crowded out those associations. So part of the problem we have now is, as a gentleman points out, it's like, well, we have this many poor and this many churches. Well, we also have this many broken families and many fewer organizations. And some of those are actually the result of state policies that incentivize the breakdown of marriage and incentivize individualism because the state wants individuals because it leads to centralization. So I'd say there's not a perfect answer, and I think that it's important to have a social safety net because the political community is a community. But I think I would say the problem, there's just not enough churches to deal with it. One, then churches need to do more. And two, policy needs to not crowd out those churches and those private associations from doing that. And then the third thing I'll say is because all the time in the developing world, which is different from the United States, they'll say if we don't give foreign aid, people are going to die. Well, that's just not true because what we're doing is we're treating a chronic problem like an emergency situation. And so we have to also make that distinction. And the problem with large state organizations, generally speaking, is they look at everything as an emergency or in a caseload instead of the personal attention that's needed with Christian charity. And that's why I think you absolutely can and should have a social safety net, but that it should be minimal so that you actually increase solidarity and love and friendship in society by increasing the need for us to help one another.
Can you define the word, what was the S word you said, sodality? Sodality. Is that a group of people where you can know everybody and personal solidarity with each other? So it's like a unit of relationship where the relationships are subject-subject rather than subject-object.
Yeah, I don't know if you need to know everybody, but so for example, certain, clubs or the Samaritan Ministries or the Knights of Columbus, that'd be a sodality, right? So the Knights of Columbus is an American organization started for Catholics to do disability insurance and all that kind of stuff. And so what happens?
We're still on the first question, Michael.
Yeah, each parish, but you asked a second. Each parish would have its own, number. They're Knights of Columbus 167. This is the parish. So it's both an organization that may be bigger, but also have smaller places, so that Scott and Larry do know each other, and there's a mutual help of one another. And those are often called mutual aid societies. There are a lot of them in England in the 19th century that had to do sometimes they were church, sometimes they were regional, sometimes they were occupational. And then they also diversify risk because the horse and buggy industry went out, now we can't help each other. So they diversify risk. But yeah, there's a mix of people. So there's knowledge, but not necessarily so small that everybody knows each other.
Great.
Okay, besides showing up at, it's coming over here.
Where are you? There you are, yes, sir.
Besides showing up at church tomorrow and reading the abolition of man, how can I grow further in this understanding and reasoning?
Of justice or?
Yeah, of what we've been talking about.
Okay, definitely show up to church tomorrow. Keep holding the Lord's Day. Okay, so, and, I mean, there's, I think, a couple of.
You can't tell them to read the catechism. Just saying.
I don't know. I'm just kidding. I took away my answer. I would say, read the catechism, and then, yeah. I would say, okay, there's a couple of things. So there's intellectual resources, obviously, and there's quite a few on that, and I'm happy to get you some things to read on that. And at the Acton Institute, we have a lot of that, and other places as well. And I think, but I would say another thing that I think would be way to grow in this is by practicing it. And so this kind of relates to this gentleman's question. So how do we create a community of communities? Well, we build solidarity. We build human flourishing communities by actually going out and working with other people and helping them when they're in need. So especially in like with charity questions, you have certain skills, right? Maybe you're an accountant, or you know how to do construction, or whatever. You have skills that you can go out and work with other people. And so I think that's like actually getting involved and doing something where you have confidence is very important. So I am kind of making it, but I'm making kind of a plug for this book. But I wrote this little book called Digital Contagion. And at the end of the book, I actually talk about we need technological and social decentralization, right? We need to build social and regional ways of helping one another that's actually involved in people's lives. So I just interviewed a man who's doing work, as I said, in Missouri on poverty, and he said we have a crisis of how do you say it? We have this crisis of relationships. That we're not in relationships with other people. So I think getting to know people as subjects, working with them, helping them, having them help you, I think that's the other. Then of course there's a lot of intellectual resources. And then I think, of course, because prudence is at the source of it, prudence obviously is a virtue, but it's also connected to the spiritual gift of wisdom, and I think prayer and paying attention. And I do think really studying the tradition, studying theology, studying what does it mean to be a person, studying justice. All those things I think work together. So there's prayer, the study of both theology and philosophy, and I think the practical actions going on to help people. But I did this documentary, Poverty Inc. I mentioned, and so I would go and talk, and they would say, what do you think we should do? And I always have the worst answer, which is, I don't know. Because I don't know what needs are in the community. I don't know what skills you have. I don't know what is around you. I don't know anything. But using the principles of thinking about justice and access, that I think that gives us insight. I don't know if that's a helpful answer.
So, in the slide, and sort of not have the slide up, but in the slide where you show the institutions of justice, you list entitled to land, justice in the courts, freedom of association, freedom for exchange, and moral ecology. Steeped in the American political tradition, I sort of expected that freedom of conscience would be included in that as one of the fundamental institutions of justice. Is freedom of conscience in that grouping, or is it subsumed perhaps in a moral ecology, or is it actually not in that listing of institutions of fundamental justice?
Yeah, or is it part of freedom of association?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Most of that, first up list, I'm kind of dealing with, especially like kind of practical aspects of justice, but that's a very good question. So I would say that I think you could separate it out of moral ecology and make freedom of conscience, freedom of religion, and conscience as its own thing. And I also do think it's connected to association. So part of the problem is like, what do we mean by freedom of conscience versus freedom of religion versus freedom of worship? And so like there's at some point like what is a well-formed conscience, right? Because I can have a badly formed conscience, right? Where I think that the oppression, I think that like the slave holding is okay. I have a badly formed conscience. Do I have freedom of conscience to have slaves? Like, do I have freedom of conscience to do evil? So like, conscience, I think that's one of the questions we have to kind of ask. That's why I'm kind of thinking through this. So then there's the question, what about like freedom of religion? And how does that, I think that is both, that freedom of religion question has both a personal element we are free and you can't be compulsed to like believe something, but there is the role for the state to compel us to do lots of things. I mean, that's what law is. You know, people will say, oh, there's no you can't legislate morality. Like, yeah, that's what law is, right? It's the legislation of morality, okay? And unjust laws show, obviously, they're not just all no law at all. They actually undermine the moral fabric and the moral ecology of the place. So that's why I'm kind of hemming and hawing on this. I mean, like, is there a place? Yes. Then there's freedom of religion. I think the answer to that is yes. Okay, and I think it's connected to freedom of association. Because I actually did a podcast on this, on the problem of freedom of association. One of the problems we're having in the United States, and I'm not a lawyer, so this is, but I can give you the link to this podcast where he talks about it. Like, what's actually happening now is it's only a kind of a personal right, or like a personal feeling. And so like, part of essential to freedom of religion is actually freedom of association, to associate together to worship, right? And in the Bill of Rights, it's not just a free speech, but also the right of association is very important, and that's connected to conscience. So I would say yes. I don't include it there because I was talking about kind of justice in another way. But so in short answer, yes, it is. I think part of the institutions of justice, freedom of religion and freedom of conscience, properly understood. And yes, it is both distinct and a subset of freedom of association. So thanks for pointing that out. I'm going to think about it more, and maybe I can include it in a better way. So thank you for that.
I apologize. This is probably a little bit of a political question, but you talk a lot about like, the divination of the state, and I'm very uneducated regarding. That's kind of why I'm curious here. Is like how present do you think that is here in America? And like, in order to kind of rise against it out of love, what are small things that maybe we as just kind of everyday Christians can do against it?
That's a really good question. I don't know. I mean, I'm going to think about it here for a second. But it's a good question. I mean, I'm saying I don't know because I have to think about it. It's a very, I mean, depending, I'm not sure exactly, like, I don't mean this, like, I'm not sure exactly what you mean because you weren't clear. I think you were clear, but I could mean the same thing. How is the state divinized? I think the first part of the question, I think what we're seeing here is connecting the state and technocracy. So like our challenge is a kind of technical vision of the state, that the state's going to solve our problems of sin and suffering and evil. And we're going to do that through technology, not just digital technology, but through like this kind of almost sense of like the experts will come to our rescue to solve our problem. And science will solve the problems of death and of aging and of sickness. And if we just get there, you know, we're just going to get there. Again, this is Lewis talks about this when the man is dying. He says, you know, we've got nature whacked. And he's dying from tuberculosis. Lewis wasn't being obnoxious. He was pointing out something. I think that we live in a technocratic state where we've made progress and idle. And then the state is in a sense, the great power, right, that's going to implement this progress for us on the large scale. And so, I mean, if you see that, for example, again, I'll give you a poverty analogy. This is the idea, like, we can just transfer large amounts of wealth to the developing world, we're going to end poverty forever. I mean, like, literally, we are going to end poverty forever. Finally, that's what's fallen to us to do. Jeffrey Sachs, the technocrat, who's going to go down, and we're going to use big state power and all the things, and we're going to solve the problem. And we're gonna solve the problem of cancer. And there's like an economist who I find very interesting, even though I don't agree with her on a lot of things, named Marina Mazzucato, who wrote a book called The Entrepreneurial State, and she said, we talked about this in breakfast, she said, look, it's kind of a myth that this is made by the free market, because almost everything that makes the smartphone smart was invented by the military and funded by DARPA and the state. And she's right, actually, it's a really important point. And I actually push her further into deeper embeddedness, that it goes all the way back to Leviticus 19:16. That's why we have a commercial society in the Republic that gives us a tax base so we can have a government to build military things, that we can have an iPhone. So it's much deeper than that. But one of the things she says is in this book called Moonshot, and it's the idea like, we're going to use the state and power and together, and we're going to solve the problems of cancer and climate change, etc. Okay. I think that's a divinization of the state, and it's a divinization of technology together. So it's not simply just like the divinization of the state in the way that the Nazis did. But it's a now, in the question of how to resist that as regular Christians, I guess 2 or 3 things come to mind. One is intellectually to recognize that we're in a technocracy with where progress has become an idol. And then to say, all right, how am I going to, in a sense, not buy into that idolatry? And then how do I lead a real human life? I mean, you want to everyday resist as a Christian? You're young. I don't know how old you are, but okay. Get married, have a lot of babies, become friends with other families, educate your children together. Don't just send them to government schools. Right? Read good books, listen to beautiful music, have a garden, plant carrots. Carrots are the worst. And I'm going to buy, speaking of technological solutions to my problem, I'm going to buy one of those flame weeders. Plant the carrot, you wait, you burn the weeds. So use some technology while you do the carrots. And I would say in that sense, like, live a human life. At Carter Steed, I'm selling my podcast. I don't make any money on my podcast. Trust me, I spend a lot of money on my podcast. Okay, so, but I interviewed Carter Steed, who's a professor of law at Notre Dame, and he's the President's Council for Bioethics. And it's a beautiful section in this interview. It's very long, but it's a beautiful section in the interview where he talks about like the graceful giving and receiving. And that's where life is, like, it's not technical, love being lived out. And then I think politically, we live in a culture of death in many ways, and a culture of perfection, and a culture of kind of technical manipulation of ourselves and our bodies. And I think we have to say no. But we don't say no simply, we have to say no. But we don't just say no, we have to provide an alternative, better way of living. And that means we need to build a culture of life that affirms the goodness of being, that affirms the goodness of children, even though they can be difficult and time-consuming, that affirms the goodness of elderly people who are not simply an object to be thrown away, but someone that you should be engaged with, right? And that affirms the goodness of our body, that we're not trying to escape our body, that affirms the beauty of women. I have a very good friend of mine, she's actually Sarah's godmother. So her name is Carrie Gress. She wrote a book called Anti-Married Exposed. And so on the theme of Antichrist, she wrote a book called Anti-Married. And it's a critique of radical feminism that devalues motherhood, okay? And that devalues biology and femininity, and to affirm the goodness of women. Do not look at pornography. It's an evil. It'll destroy your soul, and it's also a lot of those women are sex slaves. Say no to those things. Resensitize yourselves to evil. Work to be patient and loving with one another. I'm a very impatient person. I'm very impatient, right? But like, this is the season of Lent, right? As we prepare ourselves for the Paschal mysteries. As we prepare ourselves for the Paschal mysteries, like, work on actually loving other people who are poor and weak, and your neighbor and your friend, and treating people with deep respect, and build a culture of life. And if you build a culture of life, then you're going to resist the culture of death and the culture of technocracy. And so it's simple things, but that are actually very, very difficult, because it's just easier to watch TV and scroll through. I mean, it is. It's just easier to scroll through your social media accounts that actually create value, or put your phone down. I mean, I think that's part of it, put your phone down, and build communities. And in doing that, you're gonna resist the culture of progress, technology, and perfection. That's technical. You're gonna build a civilization of love.
Episode 33 in Michael's podcast with Elizabeth Corey, they talk about defending things like literature and poetry and love. And one of the arguments that they make in that is, don't just sit around and defend poetry, have people over to your house and read it. It's this idea that, like, do the things you defend with gusto and love and enjoyment. And that is the fundamental first step of all things that you defend. And then go on to defend the thing. I think that was a really good section of that.
Elizabeth's great.
Yeah.
Professor at Baylor.
And that book by Carter Snead, even if you just read the introduction to the book, where he counterbalances communities of uncalculated giving and gracious receiving with expressive individualism, and he intentionally counterposes the two, because without understanding expressive individualism and how it functions, it's very difficult to understand in our culture a Christian worldview. Understanding the two differentiated helps us understand the Christian worldview generalized and particularized in better clarity, in some sense.
Yeah, that book is awesome. Again, like this podcast I did was 2 hours, so I always listen to everything on fast speed, so you can listen fast, but I'm super impatient.
All right, who's next? I
That's
think
great.
we'd probably do one more, given the answer and links we're doing.
My question's about the either or both and bit.
Yeah.
I think Robbie Zacharias said this multiple times, and he put it like, I think there was an Indian professor who was on the both and side, and Robbie Zacharias would get in a debate and eventually ask, well, is it either or is it both and? And then the professor said, oh, the both and does seem to merge, doesn't it? And then, so I think kind of the Western ears would kind of chuckle and say, oh, okay, notch one up for Robbie. But I wonder about the kind of the consistency of that, though, like about Easterners, how they hear it, and to explain. I think it's best with the other Lewis, who in Alice in Wonderland had, I think it was the Queen of Hearts, asked something like, "Do you mean what you say, or do you say what you mean?" And I suppose the kind of the Eastern ears would be of that they say what they mean, meaning that the precise dictionary definition that they draw out may not be clearly, there's something that they're saying, but it's not going to be so logically determined. So the question is how, if like an Easterner was listening, and then they wouldn't, then it's using a Western either or, saying that there's a contradiction. To get a contradiction, you have to use either or. So that seems inconsistent to use either or when you're talking to both and.
So it's inconsistent either or when talking to both, someone who thinks they're both and?
Someone who believes both and then you start using either or logic with them, then they have to sort of come over to your side. But you could also go over to their side and say that statements are not always either true or false. They could be somewhere in the middle. So saying,
Is that always the case?
that's your either or paradigm.
No, you're just giving me an either or paradigm. Because I have to choose.
That's if you're in an either or paradigm, you're saying I'm in an either or paradigm, but I could be in a both and paradigm. And but it's just something you have to accept either way. So if I'm both
Either way, I've got to accept it. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, it's a good question. I like it. Don't take my pushing you to be obnoxious. I mean it in a serious manner. I think you're dealing with a being game and not a semantic game, and I think you're making an error. And I'll tell you why. It's already implicit in the question that you're making an error, right? And I make errors too, so welcome to the club. But so one is, even if we think about East and West, I think is East and West is either or, and I think that's maybe even a false distinction to make. I mean, what is Judaism? Is Judaism Eastern or is it Western? Right? is a question. Two, there's a fundamental human experience of a quest. Like, so Aristotle, who's Western Greek, but that makes it Mediterranean. So, but he was actually Macedonian. Anyway, in metaphysics, book 4 has a question of what's called the law of non-contradiction. Okay? And he argues that the fundamental question of being is that there is a law of non-contradiction. And so the argument is this, that a thing cannot both be and not be at the same time in the same respect. That the thing cannot both be and not be at the same time and in the same respect. So I can have a pain in my arm here, but not have a pain in my arm here at the same time. So you have a pain in your arm and not have a pain in your arm at the same time, but not in the same respect. Okay, I can have a pain in my arm this morning, but not have a pain in my arm now in the exact same respect. Okay, but I can't have a pain in my arm now and not have a pain in my arm now in the same respect. Okay, in your question, you use the law of non-contradiction. It was implicit in the contradiction. It's either or, both and. You're using these two things, and so it's one or the other. And so at the core, now what happens if the law of non-contradiction doesn't hold? If the law of non-contradiction is not true, then it's true. Wait, what? Yeah, if the law of non-contradiction is not true, then it's true. Because if the law of non-contradiction is not true, then the law of non-contradiction can both be true and not true at the same time in the same respect, which means the law of non-contradiction is true. Okay, it goes back to the question of truth. Truth doesn't exist. Let me say something really important. People say truth doesn't exist. I say, is that true? Okay. You can't know the truth, right? So I'm going to argue right now, the truth exists and you can know it, but that doesn't mean we do. We might all think the truth exists and we can know it. All of us could be wrong. Okay, so when you're thinking about this question, I think there's like multiple layers to your question. I think there's an apostolic thing, like, what's the apostolic evangelical way to do it? Maybe you're getting to as well. But I think so first of all, this is not a semantics game. This is a being game. It's like the principle of identity. This is this. Okay, this is not that. Right? It's not both and. It's either or. And it's rooted down into being. Now, there is both and that's why I mentioned both and then there's different experiences. So you either choose for Christ or against Christ. Now, does that mean when I choose for Christ, I perfectly obey the commandments? No. But you're still choosing for Christ. You can't choose for Christ and against Christ. You can halfway do it, you can half step or whatever like that. So there's either or that's rooted in something is either true in certain cases, or it's false. It's either true that I am a human being, and therefore I have dignity, or it's not. But I can't both be a human being and not be a human being at the same time, in the same respect. And that's the law of non-contradiction. That's fundamental. So then you have the question of, the Eastern, I lived in Japan for 5 years, and Eastern people that I met still live according to the law of non-contradiction. No Eastern person that I've ever met has ever walked into the thing thinking there's a bus here and not a bus here at the same time in the same respect. We absolutely live the law of non-contradiction constantly. Okay? And this is actually a really important point because it goes back to lived experience. Our lived experience is living the law of non-contradiction. But now, so then we have this question of there's mystery in the world and there's complexity in the world. And we can't fully articulate absolutely everything perfectly. And those two things really can go together. That's called life. So this is why I think the framing of I was kind of joking with you, but the framing of your question actually implied the law of non-contradiction. It implied it. It was implicit. It has to.
From a Western point of view, it does.
From a Western point of view, it doesn't make
exactly.
sense. That's not the question. I get it. Okay, I totally get it. But what does a Western point of view mean?
That things are either logically true or false, and there's not much in between.
That's not a Western point of view. That's a utilitarian empiricist point of view, but not a Western point of view.
The law of non-contradiction, I would say, is Western. And you say it's fundamental, but okay,
But okay, so well, whether it comes from Aristotle or not, I mean that it's not. I think you're. I mean, this is a longer conversation, so I'm going to bring out a handle of it. But the idea that it's Western is what is the difference between West and East? What do you mean by East?
okay, so and by East I mean like allowing systems like with 4 different truth values where you could have true and true and true and false and false and true and false and false. Like something is both. But we have this sort of understanding that something is either true or false.
Well, no. Sometimes we have an understanding that something is either true or false, like the law of non-contradiction, right? And then other times we think, well, it's partially true, partially false, it's clear, it's unclear, it's mystery, there's mysticism. I mean, there's a deep mystical tradition both in Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism. If you read, for example, the works of John of the Cross or Teresa of Avila, who are both mystics, or Thomas Aquinas, who's also a mystic, and you read, say, their philosophical writing, you see both either or and both and. And in the Western, in the Eastern tradition as well, I think what you might be getting at, and I think is important, is that modern Enlightenment Western understanding, which has disenchanted the world and become very utilitarian in its calculus, tends to have reductionist understandings of reason. So for example, love, beauty, goodness, truth, like I mentioned earlier, those things would be like, those are outside the realm of reason, right? But an older Western view would say, no, those things are absolutely within the realm of reason, and even though you cannot empirically verify them, they're in the realm of reason. And then Aristotle talks about this thing called phronesis, for example. It's this, young people are good at geometry, but they don't have wisdom. They don't have phronesis, which is called practical wisdom. And so there's a deep tradition throughout the West of this idea that some things are multifaceted and there's complexity and mystery around them. And then some things are true or false. The East does not reject mathematical principles. In fact, some of our influence in Western math comes from Eastern math. I just think the way you're even approaching the question of East and West is like you're taking a part of reality, you're taking a certain part of reductionist Western modern life, which is often Western and postmodern, and you're applying that to the entire Western tradition, which doesn't hold that, and then creating a false dichotomy between East and West and the understanding of both truth and the law of non-contradiction. So, yeah, you can say to me over and over again, well, that's just Western. But you can't refute the law of non-contradiction or the principle of identity. It's self-refuting to do it. And so then you can say, well, logic doesn't matter. And then we can say, we are knocking on the door of nihilism, right? So why is logic better than non-logic? Why is reason better than non-reason? Why is justice better than injustice? I mean, we can walk down the path of nihilism. And that path's open. Why is justice better than injustice? That's just a Western idea. Why is reason better than non-reason? That's just a Western idea. Why is good better than evil? That's just a Western idea. Why is logic better than non-logic? That's just a Western idea. But I would argue you're not Eastern, you're on the path of nihilism. And when nihilism reigns, abusive power reigns. So I would just say, like, I lived in the East. I speak Japanese. I think you're taking a postmodern Western notion and applying it to Eastern people. That's what I think you're doing.
Okay, we gotta stop somewhere, and that's kind of a weird place, but whatever. So I think Michael and I are kicking around for just a few minutes after this. But thanks everybody for coming. Thank you for taking some of your Saturday to do this. Yes, please.
So I want to thank everybody, and I also want to say thanks for the question. It's a good question. And thanks for the question that pointed out that I left out conscience. And I want to say, like, look, we disagree. He's wrong. But no, I'm serious. He's wrong and dangerous. Yeah, it's bad. But guess what? We're Christian brothers who love each other. And how else are we going to figure out whether we're right or wrong? How else am I going to grow in my insight if I don't get challenged by it? How else are we going to do it? And this is part of the philosophical attitude. It's like, the thing is, somebody might be uncomfortable because like I'm like wrong. Okay, what, I'm a philosopher. Like, that's what you do. You fight. I have a very good friend of mine. He comes to our house.
Are they not passive aggressive in Grand Rapids?
What?
Are they not passive aggressive?
I'm from California. I have a friend, his name is Kishore Jayabal, he's a great guy. He's from Flint. Kishore, you can tell. Anyway, and he came over to the house, and my children were like, Dad, like, he disagrees with everything you say. I'm like, oh yeah, that's why he's like, we're good friends. And he's like, even sometimes, like, you'll have argued something 20 minutes later, he'll come back and then take your argument because now he's disagreeing with you. Oh yeah, he's a total contrarian. But anyway, not only is he a very good friend, he's actually the father of one of my children. He, like, every time I talk to him, I have to wrestle with problems and it makes me better. And I realize I make errors. Okay? So I want to say, I know it's a little bit harsh, but I say I think you're wrong. I think you're wrong. Right? And I think it's actually important, and I think it's dangerous to walk on the path of liberalism. However, I also want to say, I apologize that like I'm a guest and I'm a little bit harsh with one of your parishioners, but I want to say, like, I take it in the sense of like, let's, like, we can now go have a coffee together because we're engaging together as human beings trying to seek after the truth. And I think the question he asked is a good one, and it's an important one to wrestle with, even if I didn't totally agree with everything of it. And so I'm grateful that I'm here, and I hope that you, my friend, take this in the way I do, that this is not personal, we're seeking after the truth.
Yeah, I just want to say it's really important, and what's part of the Christian tradition that Michael alluded to is Christians throughout the West also refuted the idea that using the law of non-contradiction and then using that reasonably as a excluding principle as the only way to get to knowledge, and so said things couldn't go together that really could go together because their reason had so much hubris and pride in it that they thought that they could prove all these things by this process of exclusion by just using reason, destroyed the huge portions of the foundational Christian faith in the West and how it caused us to flourish from each other. And a lot of people in the East recognized that was happening and said, you guys are doing something that's idiotic. And they were right about that. I think you agree with that, right? It's kind of.
Well, I think so. I think the last part.
Yeah, that there were people who were like, that's stupid. You guys, that sort of like Cartesianism gone crazy all the way to post-modernity. That's bad. And there were people who were in the eastern part of the world, which of course east-west and globe is weird, but who were like, that's wrong. And they may have said, you need to be more both and, but that didn't mean that when they wrote their books, they didn't use the logic of non-contradiction and identity as the basis of every sentence, but they still could say, these two things are not as excluded as you think, they actually go together, and you're excluding them stupidly, because you think you can do that with reason you can't. And so sometimes the issue is, it's not like the issue of logic, it's the issue of hubris or pride or the rejection of mystery because we want to have all the answers. And that has more to do with their psychology and our insecurity. But that gets back to embodiedness and humanness and all of those things so we can know ourselves well enough to know how we're even thinking. Does that make sense? Remember, when Michael says we need to be more philosophical, he doesn't mean we need to learn more words with more syllables. He's saying we need to love wisdom enough to ask questions, pursue it, and think together. That's what it means. It's the love of wisdom. Okay? Thanks so much, you guys. I'm so glad you're here. If you want to help a little bit cleaning up, just ask Charlie or one of the volunteers what you can do to help so that we can knock it down quick. Thanks so much.